In the harsh wilderness of 1880s Arizona, a desperate cowboy's act of compassion would change everything. When Jake Morrison stumbled upon two Apache sisters fleeing for their lives, he made a choice that would shake the very foundations of his world. What happened next would test loyalty, challenge prejudice, and reveal the true cost of doing what's right in a land divided by fear and hatred. The sun blazed mercilessly over the Arizona territory as Jake Morrison guided his weary horse through the rocky canyon. His clothes were patched and worn, his boots held together by leather strips and prayers. For 3 months, he'd worked a double-R ranch for barely enough to keep body and soul together, but it was honest work. And in 1883, honest work was hard to find for a man with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn conscience. The ranch foreman, Bull Garrett, had sent Jake to check the northern fence line where cattle had been going missing. Some blamed rustlers. Others whispered about Apache raids, though most tribes had been forced onto reservations years ago. Jake didn't much care who was taking the cattle. He just needed this job to last through winter. As he rounded a boulder the size of a cabin, his horse suddenly shied, nearly throwing him from the saddle. There, huddled against the red rock wall, were 2 Native American women. Even from a distance, Jake could see they were enormous, each standing well over 6 feet tall, with powerful builds that spoke of lives spent in the wilderness. Their traditional Apache clothing was torn and stained with blood, and their dark eyes held a mixture of defiance and desperation that made Jake's heart skip. The older sister, who appeared to be in her 30s, held a makeshift spear fashioned from a broken branch. Her younger sister, perhaps 25, clutched a wounded arm to her chest. Both women watched Jake with the intensity of cornered wolves, ready to fight despite their obvious exhaustion. Jake slowly dismounted, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. He'd heard enough stories about Apache warriors to know these women could kill him with their bare hands if they chose to. But something in their eyes, a familiar look of hunger and hopelessness, reminded him of his own reflection in recent months. The older sister spoke in Apache, her voice carrying both warning and pleading. Jake didn't understand the words, but he understood desperation. He'd felt it gnawing at his own belly for months. Slowly, he reached into his saddlebags and pulled out his meager lunch: hardtack, jerky, and a precious orange he'd been saving for Sunday. He placed the food on a rock between them and stepped back, his hands raised peacefully. The sisters exchanged glances, and Jake saw tears mixing with the dirt on their faces. They were starving, exhausted, and far from any help. Whatever had driven them to this canyon, it wasn't good. As the women cautiously approached the food, Jake noticed riders in the distance, at least 6 men on horseback, moving with the methodical pattern of a hunting party. The sisters saw them too, and terror flashed across their faces. Without thinking, Jake grabbed the reins of his horse and gestured for them to follow him deeper into the canyon, away from the approaching riders. Jake led the Apache sisters through a maze of narrow passages he discovered during his fence-riding duties. The canyon system was larger than most people realized, with hidden alcoves and natural shelters carved by centuries of flash floods. His horse picked its way carefully over loose stones while the 2 women moved with surprising grace despite their injuries and exhaustion. The older sister, whom Jake had mentally dubbed Ayana for her resembling a description he'd once heard of an eternal bloom, supported her wounded sibling with remarkable strength. The younger woman's arm was clearly broken, hanging at an unnatural angle, but she made no sound of complaint as they climbed over fallen boulders and squeezed through tight passages. Behind them, the sound of pursuing horses echoed off the canyon walls. Jake recognized the voices now: Bull Garrett and his men, along with what sounded like a cavalry patrol. They were calling out orders, coordinating their search with military precision. Jake's stomach knotted as he realized he was now actively helping fugitives, though from what crime, he had no idea. They reached a hidden alcove Jake had discovered weeks earlier while chasing a stray calf. The space was barely large enough for the four of them, Jake, his horse, and the two imposing Apache women, but it was invisible from the main canyon floor. Water seeped from the rocks above, creating a small pool that had saved Jake during several scorching afternoons. As they settled into the cramped space, Jake got his first close look at the sisters. Despite their current condition, both women possessed a striking beauty and dignity that transcended their circumstances. Their high cheekbones and intelligent eyes spoke of nobility, and Jake began to suspect these weren't ordinary refugees. The intricate beadwork on their clothing, though torn, suggested they held important positions in their tribe. The younger sister's condition was worse than Jake had initially thought. Besides her broken arm, she had a deep gash on her leg that had soaked her doeskin dress with blood. Using gestures and pointing, Jake tried to communicate his intention to help. Ayana watched him carefully as he tore strips from his own shirt to make bandages, her hand never straying far from her makeshift weapon. As Jake worked to clean and bind the wounds with water from his canteen, Ayana began to speak in broken English. Her voice was deep and melodious, each word carefully chosen. "You help us. Why?" she asked, her dark eyes searching his face for deception. Jake paused in his bandaging, considering the question. Why was he helping them? Any sensible man would have turned them in for the reward money that was surely being offered. Instead, he was risking his job, possibly his life, for two strangers. "Because it's right," he finally answered, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. The pursuing voices were getting closer, and Jake could hear Bull Garrett's distinctive bellow echoing through the canyon. "Spread out. They couldn't have gone far. These savages are worth $100 each, dead or alive." The casual cruelty in his boss's voice made Jake's blood run cold and confirmed his suspicions about why the sisters were running. As night fell over the canyon, Jake learned the terrible truth about why the Apache sisters were being hunted. Through Ayana's halting English and expressive gestures, a horrific story emerged that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. The sisters were the daughters of Chief Standing Bear, a respected leader who had refused to relocate his small band to the San Carlos Reservation. For months, they had lived peacefully in the remote mountains, hunting and gathering as their ancestors had done for generations. They posed no threat to anyone, asking only to be left alone on land that had been their home for centuries. But Colonel Marcus Webb, the new commander at Fort Apache, had different plans. He saw the remaining free Apache as an affront to his authority and a potential rallying point for reservation Indians who might be tempted to leave. More importantly, he had discovered that the sisters possessed detailed knowledge of hidden water sources and mineral deposits throughout the territory, information that would be invaluable to mining companies and railroad interests. 3 days ago, Webb had sent a patrol to capture the sisters alive, with orders to kill their father and the other men of their band. The massacre had been swift and brutal. Standing Bear and 12 warriors had died defending their camp, while Ayana and her sister, Itzel, managed to escape into the wilderness. But Webb's men had been tracking them ever since, determined to complete their mission. Jake listened to this story with growing horror and rage. He'd fought in enough range wars to know the difference between justice and murder, and what Webb had done was nothing short of genocide. The sisters weren't criminals or warriors. They were survivors of a massacre, guilty of nothing more than being born Apache in a territory that no longer wanted them to exist. As Ayana spoke, Itzel's condition continued to deteriorate. The younger sister had developed a fever, and her wounded arm had begun to swell ominously. Without proper medical care, infection would set in soon, and in her weakened state, it would likely kill her. Jake faced an impossible choice. He could try to get help from the nearest town, but that would mean leaving the sisters vulnerable to capture or revealing their location to people who might turn them in for the reward money. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts. This time, it wasn't Bull Garrett's voice echoing through the canyon. It was Colonel Webb himself, accompanied by what sounded like a full cavalry patrol. Jake pressed himself against the rock wall and peered carefully around the edge of their hiding place. Webb sat tall in his saddle, his uniform immaculate despite the harsh conditions. Even in the moonlight, Jake could see the man's cold, calculating eyes as he surveyed the canyon. "They're here somewhere," Webb announced to his men. "Apache don't just disappear, despite what the old-timers claim. We'll search every inch of this canyon if necessary. Those sisters are the key to opening up this entire territory for development, and I won't let them slip away." Behind Webb rode Bull Garrett and several ranch hands, their faces grim in the torchlight. Jake realized with a sinking heart that his boss had thrown in completely with the military, probably hoping for a share of whatever riches Webb expected to extract from the sisters' knowledge. There would be no help coming from the Double R Ranch. If anything, they would be among the most determined hunters. As the patrol settled in to make camp at the canyon entrance, effectively trapping Jake and the sisters in the hidden alcove, Ayanna gripped his arm with surprising strength. "You must go," she whispered urgently. "Take horse, right away. They find you here, they kill you too." But Jake looked at Itzel's fevered face and Ayanna's desperate eyes, and knew he couldn't abandon them. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The next morning brought a new horror that would test Jake's resolve like nothing before. Colonel Webb's men had brought tracking dogs, bloodhounds trained to hunt escaped slaves before the war and now put to use hunting Apache. The baying of the hounds echoed through the canyon like the howls of demons, growing closer with each passing hour. Jake knew their hiding place wouldn't remain secret much longer. The dogs would eventually pick up their scent, and when they did, the alcove would become a death trap. But moving Itzel in her condition seemed equally hopeless. The younger sister was now delirious with fever, muttering in Apache and occasionally crying out in pain. Her broken arm had swollen to twice its normal size, and dark streaks were beginning to appear on her skin, clear signs of blood poisoning. As the morning wore on, Jake made a desperate decision. Using hand signals and whispered words, he communicated his plan to Ayanna. He would create a distraction, drawing the patrol away from this section of the canyon, giving the sisters a chance to escape deeper into the wilderness. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. Ayanna's response surprised him. Instead of gratitude, her eyes flashed with anger and something that looked like disappointment. "You think we are weak?" she hissed in her broken English. "You think Apache women cannot fight?" Jake tried to explain that he was trying to protect them, but Ayanna cut him off with a gesture that was unmistakably dismissive. What happened next would forever change Jake's understanding of courage and strength. Ayanna began to sing, not loudly, but with a haunting melody that seemed to seep into the very stones around them. It was a death song. Jake realized, a traditional Apache chant sung by warriors preparing for their final battle. But as she sang, something miraculous occurred. Itzel's eyes opened, clear and alert for the first time since her fever had begun. The younger sister listened to her elder's song, then added her own voice, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrible. As they sang together, both women seemed to grow stronger, their backs straightening, their eyes gaining focus and determination. Jake watched in amazement as the sisters performed what could only be called a transformation. Using strips torn from their clothing and techniques passed down through generations of Apache warriors, they fashioned splints and supports that allowed Itzel to use her broken arm. They created weapons from broken branches and sharp stones, moving with a coordination that spoke of years of training and shared understanding. But the most shocking transformation was in their attitude. These were no longer frightened refugees hiding in a cave. These were Apache warriors preparing for battle, and Jake suddenly understood why their people had held, off the U.S. Army for decades, despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The sisters possessed a fierce dignity and martial skill that no amount of civilization could diminish. As the baying of the hounds grew closer, Ayanna turned to Jake with eyes that now held the hardness of obsidian. "You helped us when you could have taken the gold," she said, her English suddenly much clearer and more precise than before. "Now we help you understand what it means to be Apache." She handed him a war lance crafted from a straight branch and a knife blade, its balance perfect despite the improvised construction. The sound of horses and men was now very close, and Jake could hear Colonel Webb shouting orders to his troops. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Jake realized he was no longer just helping two fugitive women. He was about to fight alongside Apache warriors in what would likely be his last battle. The poor cowboy who had started this journey looking for stray cattle was about to discover what it truly meant to stand for, something greater than himself. The attack came at noon, when the sun was highest and the shadows shortest, leaving no place to hide in the canyon's harsh light. Colonel Webb's men had finally tracked them to the alcove, and Jake found himself pressed against the rock wall beside two Apache warriors who happened to be women facing down a dozen soldiers, and ranch hands armed with repeating rifles and military discipline. Webb himself appeared at the entrance to their hiding place, his uniform dusty but his arrogance intact. Well, he drawled, taking in the unlikely trio with cold amusement. "A cowboy and two squaws. Jake Morrison, isn't it? Bull Garrett tells me you're one of his most reliable hands. Shame to see you throw your life away for a couple of savages, and whatever fool notion of honor you've got rattling around in that empty head." Jake felt his grip tighten on the improvised war lance, but before he could respond, Ayanna stepped forward. In that moment, she seemed to tower over everyone present, her presence filling the small space with an authority that made even the colonel take an unconscious step backward. "I am Ayanna, daughter of Standing Bear, keeper of the sacred springs, guardian of the ancient ways," she declared in English so clear and precise it made Jake's earlier assessment of her language skills seem laughably wrong. "You murdered my father and my people for gold and land that was never yours to take. Now you will face the consequences of that choice." What followed was unlike any battle Jake had ever witnessed or heard described. The Apache sisters moved with a fluid coordination that seemed almost supernatural, turning their small alcove into a fortress and their improvised weapons into instruments of precision warfare. Ayanna's spear found its mark with every throw, while Itzel, despite her injuries, wielded a war club with devastating accuracy. But it was their tactical brilliance that truly amazed Jake. Using the canyon's acoustics, they created the illusion of a much larger force, their war cries echoing and multiplying until it sounded like an entire war party was descending on Webb's men. They used ricochets and falling stones to deadly effect, turning the very landscape into their ally. Jake found himself fighting with a skill and ferocity he never knew he possessed. Perhaps it was the inspiration of fighting alongside such magnificent warriors, or perhaps it was the righteous anger that had been building in his chest since learning of the massacre. But every shot he fired found its target, every movement seemed perfectly timed. The tide of battle shifted dramatically when reinforcements arrived, but not the kind Colonel Webb was expecting. A band of Apache warriors led by a young chief named Cochise appeared on the canyon rim, having tracked Webb's forces from their massacre site. These weren't the broken reservation Indians that Webb's propaganda had described, but proud warriors seeking vengeance for their murdered chief and kinsman. As arrows began raining down from above and war cries echoed from all directions, Webb's disciplined soldiers began to panic. Several of his men had already fallen to the sisters' deadly accuracy, and now they found themselves caught in a crossfire between the alcove below and the warriors above. In the chaos, Jake saw Bull Garrett attempting to flee on horseback, but Ayanna's spear caught him in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his saddle. The ranch foreman who had spoken so casually about $100 bounties on human lives now crawled desperately for cover, his arrogance replaced by terror. Colonel Webb, however, stood his ground with the cold courage of a professional soldier. Drawing his service revolver, he aimed directly at Ayanna, his finger beginning to squeeze the trigger. "If I can't have you alive," he snarled, "then I'll settle for watching you die." Time seemed to slow as Jake saw death approaching the woman who had shown him what true courage looked like. Without thinking, he threw himself forward, putting his own body between Webb's gun and Ayanna just as the colonel fired. The bullet struck Jake in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. As darkness closed in around him, Jake heard Ayanna's voice calling his name and felt her strong hands pulling him to safety. The battle continued to rage around them, but for Jake Morrison, the poor cowboy who had saved 2 Apache sisters, the fight was over. Jake awakened to the sound of gentle singing and the smell of burning sage. For a moment, he thought he had died and gone to whatever afterlife awaited cowboys who died fighting the good fight. But the sharp pain in his chest and the familiar sensation of rough blankets against his skin told him he was still very much alive. He was lying in what appeared to be a traditional Apache shelter, its walls made of bent branches and hide, its interior filled with the warm glow of a small fire. Ayanna sat beside him, her powerful hands surprisingly gentle as she changed the bandages on his wound. Her sister Itzel, looking much healthier than when he'd last seen her, was preparing some kind of herbal medicine in a clay pot. "The bullet missed your heart by inches," Ayanna explained when she saw he was awake. "Our medicine man says the spirits guided it away from anything vital, but you lost much blood. You've been unconscious for 3 days." As Jake's strength gradually returned over the following days, he learned what had happened after he fell. The Apache warriors had overwhelmed Webb's remaining men, killing the colonel and most of his soldiers in the fierce fighting that followed. Bull Garrett had survived but fled back to the Double R Ranch, where he immediately fired Jake and spread word that his former employee had betrayed white settlers to help Apache raiders. But the most significant change was in the Apache community itself. Word of Jake's sacrifice had spread throughout the scattered bands, and many who had been considering surrender to the reservation system instead chose to join Cochise' growing resistance movement. The story of the white cowboy who had given his life to protect Apache sisters became a powerful symbol of the possibility for understanding between peoples. Young Cochise visited Jake personally to thank him and to offer him a place among their people. "You have proven that honor and courage are not bound by the color of a man's skin or the language he speaks," the chief said through Ayanna's translation. "You will always be welcome in our camps, and our children will sing songs of your bravery around our fires." As Jake's health improved, he found himself learning Apache customs and language from Ayanna and Itzel. The sisters taught him their people's deep connection to the land, their complex understanding of desert survival, and their rich oral traditions. In return, Jake shared his knowledge of ranching, firearms, and the tactics used by the U.S. military, information that would prove invaluable in the battles to come. But perhaps the most profound change was in Jake himself. The poor cowboy who had started this journey looking for stray cattle had discovered something far more valuable than any wage or reward. He had found a cause worth fighting for and people worth dying for. More importantly, he had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in gold or cattle, but in the relationships we build and the principles we're willing to defend. Months later, when Jake was finally strong enough to travel, he faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could return to the white world, find another ranch job, and try to rebuild his old life. Or he could stay with the Apache, continuing to fight alongside Ayanna and her people for their right to exist as free human beings. The decision wasn't difficult. Jake Morrison, the cowboy who had saved 2 Apache sisters, chose to become Jake Morrison, the white warrior who fought for justice in a land where justice was rare. He never again worried about where his next meal would come from or whether he could afford new boots, because he had discovered that a man who stands for something greater than himself is never truly poor. And on quiet evenings around Apache campfires, when Ayana would sing the old songs and Itzel would tell stories of their ancestors, Jake would remember that single moment when he chose compassion over fear and realize it had been the richest decision of his life. Sometimes the greatest treasures come not from what we take, but from what we choose to give away.